Good. Well, another Sunday, another lovely afternoon tea, and so lovely to see so many faces here who have been with us for a month on end since we have started afternoon tea sessions. So if we haven't met before, I am Linda, emergency medicine physician, and I'm here with my lovely co-host, Dr. Erica. She's a GP from the West Midlands, and we are both lifestyle medicine physicians. Now, in the chat below, please let us know where you are zooming in with us. And we love to hear where you're from, what brought you here to afternoon tea, and how we can serve you and your community best. We have wonderful news. We have started working together with Dandelion Seeds Foundation to bring the prestigious Complete Health Improvement Program free of charge for residents of the West Somerset and Taunton Deane area for now. And you can sign up starting this week for the program. And it's a 10-week program. If you're ready to commit to change your life, please do come on and start the program with us. We host afternoon tea every Sunday at 5 p.m. UK time, where you can connect with world-renowned experts. And we share 3 actionable takeaways that you can implement in your life right away to start achieving your health goals. If you're ready to implement your life goals, join our free membership on our website to be part of our supportive community to set you up for success.
And today we are so honored to have Dr. T. Colin Campbell for afternoon tea to talk about the science of human health and nutrition, on which he has dedicated over 60 years of his life. His primary focus is on the association between diet and disease, particularly cancer. Although largely known for the China study, one of the most comprehensive studies of health and nutrition ever conducted and recognized by the New York Times as the Grand Prix of epidemiology, Dr. Campbell's profound impact also includes extensive involvement in education, public policy, and lab research. Dr. Campbell grew up on a dairy farm and was the first in his family to go to university, where he studied pre-veterinary medicine at Pennsylvania State University. He was then offered a scholarship and research opportunity, and so he completed his education at Cornell University and MIT in nutrition, biochemistry, and toxicology. He then spent 10 years on the faculty of Virginia Tech's Department of Biochemistry and Nutrition before returning to Cornell, where he presently holds his endowed chair as the Jacob Gold Schumann Professor Emeritus of Nutritional Biochemistry in the Division of Nutritional Sciences. Dr. Campbell has actively participated in the development of national and international nutrition policy and has authored over 350 research papers. Throughout his career, he has confronted a great deal of confusion surrounding nutrition and its effects. It is precisely this confusion that he has focused so much on in recent years. In order to synthesize the findings of his long and rewarding career and to give back to the public whose lives are threatened by the rampant misinformation and special interests, Dr. Campbell has also authored multiple books, including his most recent release, The Future of Nutrition, and has been featured in various documentary films. He has delivered hundreds of lectures around the world and is the founder of the T. Colin Campbell Center of Nutrition Studies and the online plant-based nutrition certificate in partnership with eCornell. Welcome, Dr. Campbell.
Welcome, Dr. Campbell. Thank you very much for joining us for afternoon tea.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Fantastic. You're doing a great project. It's great.
Thank you so much. Well, Dr. Campbell, we have heard your incredible story, life story, and I would love to know, what do you think after growing up in a dairy farm? I think even your doctoral dissertation and early research actually focused on how to increase consumption and production of animal-based protein. How did you go from that to coining the term whole food, plant-based way of eating?
Well, that's many years. Obviously, yes, when I grew up on the dairy farm, went to graduate school, did research on advancing the consumption, if you will, of more protein, especially high quality protein and animal foods. I mean, that was consistent with my own background and so forth. And that's what was consistent with what all my colleagues also thought. So it's common knowledge. And so when I was in Virginia Tech, my first academic position at the time, we had a project in the Philippines. I was asked to coordinate that project. It was a U.S. State Department project, actually. And the object of the project was to work out some kind of arrangements by which these malnourished children in the Philippines might regain their health. And the focus was on making sure they get enough protein, animal protein. So, and as I say, that was consistent with everything I knew and I did. But then I saw something that was a little bit suspicious. You know, some of the children who were consuming the levels of protein like we do in the West, not too many families, but they were the ones that seemed at higher risk for getting liver cancer of all things. And so that made me have to ask the question, if we're supposed to be advancing the consumption of animal protein, but at the same time we have this information, we got to do something. And I need to know what it is. So I got funding and set up a big research program where I was. And through many years, I came to learn first off that the animal protein does increase liver cancer very dramatically, I must say. And that was pretty striking. Not particularly welcomed by my colleagues, for one thing, because to see such a thing like that. But nonetheless, that's what we saw. I was so intrigued by it that we learned some other things. We could turn cancer on by giving animal protein. There's experimental animal studies at that time. We could turn cancer on by giving more animal protein, turn it off when they took the protein away, or we replaced it with plant protein. It was truly dramatic. And of course, when one sees that kind of effect, very provocative and unusual, the only way we can sort of gain some traction with that idea is to ask the question, well, how does that work? You know, how does that work biochemically? So then in that case, I spent quite a number of years with a lot of pre-doctoral and postdoctoral students, sort of asking what mechanism accounts for this effect. And interestingly, every time we look for a mechanism that might account for the effect, we found one. After going through at least 10, maybe to 11 or 12 or so, every time we looked for one very different kind of mechanism, they came from different parts of the cell or different organs or whatever. Every time we looked for a mechanism, as if it were a single mechanism, we saw the same result. You know, some of those mechanisms increased in activity, that meant more cancer. A couple of the mechanisms are there for protecting us. These are mechanisms to protect us against getting cancer. For example, DNA repair. You know, the whole cancer process starts with mutations, and it gets repaired on a routine basis normally. So we wanted to know, what does this have any effect on DNA repair? And, you know, one of the mechanisms had to do with the high protein diet repressed DNA repair. So it was actually compromising the one mechanism we had to protect us. And then there was another mechanism like that. There was a mechanism coming from the immune system. The immune system does its magic in very complex ways, but making antibodies, obviously, and so forth. But one of the things it does early on is to produce what we call natural killer cells. Natural killer cells, which are the early attack unit, if you will, when a foreign organism comes to us. And so the animal protein actually depressed natural killer cell activity. But this time I'm saying to myself, how in the world can each of these mechanisms, you know, be altered either up or down, but all result in the same thing? That's what led me to this concept that I really became intrigued by, that, you know, everything's working together. Mm-hmm. And in this case, it's responded to a nutrient that we all had what should we say, a great reverence for, animal protein. Of all things, high quality animal protein was actually turning on cancer. So then it came on and on and on. I saw the same thing happening with cholesterol levels in blood related to heart disease and so forth and so on. And so that my whole world, in a sense, sort of exploded. Yeah, at least from the area that I was in. You focus on one thing at a time, and maybe you spend your whole lifetime working on that one enzyme or the one mechanism, one this, one that. And I come to find out there's a bigger story here. It's a bigger story here, and it really, and whatever directs that, all that traffic, we could talk about that forever. But in any case, there is a sense within our bodies to sort of work together and create, I would say, harmony. That's what we call health. And unfortunately, we've gone off the wrong track. We ate the wrong food. So.
This is the harmony that you're talking about that we have also ripped apart by creating subspecialties within specialties and basically cutting the human up into organs, arms, left arm, right arm kind of treatment where we completely miss the point that everything works in harmony. And by separating the specialties, we are actually separating the body into organs, and that's where the problem really starts, isn't it? We have to start seeing, right? We have to start seeing the body as one whole so that we can actually start treating it as a whole and actually have results.
You know, as I'm sure know, Aristotle, a few years ago, said the whole was greater than the sum of its parts.
Exactly.
So, we've had that idea around for, a couple of millennia. So,
but instead, we are going up in the opposite direction and subspecializing and ripping the physiology into bits. Well, that explains quite a lot, and also why so many chronic diseases are linked. And once you have one chronic disease, it's very likely that you will develop the next one, and so on.
That's right.
Right.
That's right, because the causation of one is very much like the causation of another. It's all one causation.
Absolutely. And when we look at protein, as you know so much about it, we would love to ask you a little bit more in detail. When we talk about protein, we believe not all protein are made equal. And could you help us understand the difference between the different types of protein and the source of protein and how it affects our health?
Yes. We all know, I think, that protein is a big macromolecule. It's made up of a long chain of amino acids. And it has about 20 to 22 different amino acids to choose from to put them in a certain order. And of course, that becomes infinitely, we can have infinite kinds of protein because of that. So it turns out that we could get lost in those weeds if we spend too much time just thinking about one of those amino acids, whether it's there or not there, whether it's at this point in the chain or that point in the chain. That's also a reflection of the DNA template, as we all know too. The DNA template in turn sets it up for those proteins to be synthesized according to the DNA template with all the different bases. But in any case, the distinction that I happened to see was that, as I said a moment ago, animal protein, this was cow's milk protein, by the way, animal protein turns on the cancer. Plant protein, and what we used in that case was soy protein and wheat protein, it would turn it off. So I saw this sharp sort of bifurcation of animal protein on one hand, plant protein on the other. Of course, I could have looked at a lot of different proteins, but already there was some of that research already available in reference to blood cholesterol levels by another researcher back in 1980s. In any case, what he was seeing and what I was already sort of aware of, animal protein has a certain set of properties as a group. Plant proteins have a different set of properties. So with that background, animal protein, plant protein being different, which I saw in our research, it was so dramatic. Mm-hmm. Animal protein does this, and plant protein does that kind of thing. Then the question became, well, we could go and look at this structure of amino acid if we like to. And there are some differences. There's some distinct differences. But we can't rest our argument, or we can't you take our observation and depend on just, the changes of a few amino acid sequences here or there. And I'm not sure even at this point in time I can give you a template exactly, what constitutes animal protein as opposed to what constitutes plant protein. We know some really significant differences. Animal protein has more sulfur amino acids, for example, for starters, and that creates we can talk about this all the way through, but the point is, the main point is they're different. They are different, and they really do have different properties biologically. And we can see that in so many different ways. You just see these two kinds of proteins sort of just doing two different things. And within a group of animal proteins, of course, we can see some differences, but they're all together nonetheless different from all the plant proteins. Plant proteins have some distinctions as well. Some plant proteins do this and some do that kind of thing, but their differences are small in degree. The big difference is all this organization of amino acids, animal protein does something very different from what plant proteins.
And did you see that in multiple cancers? You mentioned liver cancer, but we have started to see the rise of colon cancer with the rise of Western access to meat, as well as, I believe, prostate cancer. What was your experience with that?
Yeah, well, we can learn some of that from epidemiological research that has been done over the years. And yes, we can go beyond liver cancer. Breast cancer is particularly a case in point. Breast cancer is associated with different mechanisms, obviously, different tissue, et cetera. But breast cancer in China, for example, our study in China was only 1/5 on average what it is in the West. And by the way, that comparison we were making at that time gives me a chance to make a comment here. That comparison we were making on breast cancer between China and Western countries. The Western country I had in mind, we worked with, was the UK. And these were women living on the Guernsey Island, in the UK. And I got that opportunity of working with some marvelous colleagues at Oxford University and also in the Radcliffe Infirmary, particularly Sir Richard Peto and Sir Richard Dahl before that. And so, so the comparison that really was very intriguing in terms of breast cancer in these two different countries, England being like the United States, obviously, that was traceable in large measure to levels of estrogen. The Western diet, the English American diet, estrogen would come up higher, number one, as opposed to China. Higher levels of circulating estrogen is associated with breast cancer and uterine cancer and so forth, the cervical cancer. So it's up here like this. And there's some other things too. In China, the age of menarche. In China, the average age it started when one of the lowest county was 15 years. The average age of menarche in the other end was 19 years. So all the 140 counties in China that we worked with at that time, average age of menarche ranged from 15 years to 19 years, average 17. In the United States, not just in the US in this case, I think it's the same as Britain, it was more like 11 or 12 years. So, and then in turn, I was menopause at the other end of the reproductive period. The Chinese women would have menopause earlier, 48 years on average. Western women was 52 years. So all during that period, the Western women, they consuming more animal protein, come back to that question. They have higher levels of circulating estrogen. It's monthly, cyclical over the month, of course, but nonetheless, it's pretty high compared to the Chinese. It's only about 50 to 60%. All of a sudden, then you see these differences in breast cancer rates between the United States and China, or England or China, associated with the hormone levels as well. It all just kind of started to fit together. So I have some, so it goes to other diseases. I could tell stories about a lot of different cancers.
And that just brings me to a question that we get on a repeated basis, and I would love you to address estrogen that comes from plant-based diets. How is that different, and how can we reassure our patients that it is different from the receptor point of view, and that it doesn't have the same effect as estrogen that comes from a mammal like us?
Right. Yeah, that's been a common question, and rightfully so. But the soy products, that plant does have an estrogen-like material. We have a name for it. It's called phytoestrogens, as you probably know. And so those are worrisome. If you just look at it point, alone, that's estrogen. And so you can test it in the laboratory and get some similar activities to know it's estrogen. Look at the chemical structure, it's similar, but there's differences. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out that the level, on a practical level, the level of estrogen normally consumed in legumes, not just soy, but in legumes, the amount of estrogen there, phytoestrogen, is so low. And it actually acts like an anti-estrogen. If anything, it tends to act like an anti-estrogen in a biochemical sense. So first off, those so-called estrogens in so-called plants, especially soy, for example, if anything, they're good. They're good. There's associated lower risk because they act like an anti-estrogens for the most part. Now, I don't want to go too far with this argument because I think people consume lots of soy, really piling it up. I don't know, there's some data there that's a little bit suggestive. It doesn't quite act that way when you just make the whole diet just soy. It was not a very good idea. But in a normal setting, yeah, there's the estrogens, it doesn't hurt.
Like with anything in life, taking it to an extreme is never good, is it?
That's right, exactly.
We just need to have balance, but understand why we are doing it. And there's no magic cure in a large amount of soy, but it's good to have that. It definitely is safer to eat than it is when we're eating estrogen from animals. We do talk a lot about protein in our in today's society, and it does come up on a regular basis. If people are still worried about this protein deficiency, which we have never seen actually in clinic, there was never a patient who came in with a protein deficiency. But if they are worried on a plant-based diet, how could we reassure them? And where does protein come from?
Well, you're right. You're correct. The protein deficiency phenomenon, if you will, was named kwashiorkor. That was first coined by an English lady, Elsie Whittleson. She was at Oxford at the time and met back in the 1930s. And that took a life of its own. Kwashiorkor is a problem. Kwashiorkor is a problem in all the third world countries. That in turn led to a kind of a narrative that, we got to worry about protein. We have to make sure we have to have enough. And that's exactly, in a sense, what I was doing at the beginning of my career in the Philippines. There's lots of sort of general concern. These children being malnourished because they don't get enough protein. And sort of you could trace it back to that kind of discussion. But the protein question in a Western context, what we have to concern ourselves is not about kwashiorkor. That's not the issue, really. And even those children in the poor countries that appear to have kwashiorkor, oftentimes are misdiagnosed with marasmus rather than kwashiorkor, in other words, calorie deficiency. But coming back to the question concerning protein consumption in this country and how do we work with that, I think is your question. We get all the protein we need from plants. I just make that a very firm statement on that. We can get all the protein just from a plant-based diet. We do not need to consume animal foods in order to get the protein. That's a myth. And it's been a very, very sad myth. That has lasted. I'm writing a paper on that right now, going back to trace the history of that crazy idea. But in any case, we do not need to eat animal foods for the protein content. Now, let me turn that into a couple of numbers here, maybe. The normal recommended, the level of protein in the diet that is generally recommended as being sufficient is about 10% of calories. So 8 or 10% of calories. We can get that from even, let's say, tubers. If we just had a diet with the lowest protein content, we still get enough. I mean, the food of like tubers. If we just had a diet just of tubers alone, we still get enough protein. I think we don't do that for other reasons, but nonetheless, it starts from 10% as a recommendation for everyone. Plenty. The requirement is lower, around 5 or 6%. So it goes from 5 or 6% up to about 10%. General dietary recommendation. The average protein consumption in Western society is around 17 or 18%, which is quite a big increase. All of that coming from the amount of animal food we consume. Animal food is rich in protein. That's the wrong kind of protein. So we get caught up in the weeds, and I can talk about these numbers all day long, but the point is I want to make just a general statement supported by the evidence itself that plants, all of these plants, when consumed together, they're going to meet that 10% standard. They really are. And if we consume more protein in the case of plants, 15, 16, 17, maybe up to as high as 20%, because we're consuming a lot of legumes and leafy vegetables, they're pretty rich in protein relative to calories. So even under those circumstances, we can consume a lot of protein from a plant, no problem. That's not a problem because the plants have a lot of antioxidants to protect against what otherwise might be produced from animal protein, namely these free radicals and stuff like that. So
when we are focusing so much on protein from and the misconception that protein can come from animal products only, what is it that we are missing in our diet when we are not consuming a whole food plant-based diet? What is that? What every time when we focus on this protein, we are really missing the bigger picture, right?
Right, right. Well, I don't know. And that's not been studied terribly well. You know, somebody consuming only 100% animal food. I think that's the question. You know, what are they missing? I think the question is in a technical sense. What in general though, it goes beyond the protein question. The person is consuming animal-based foods. And by the way, before I make this statement, I want to say, as we increase the concentration of animal foods in our diet, we decrease the consumption of plant foods because calorie intake is about a zero-sum game, more or less. So as we increase animal, so when we see some effect from people consuming an animal food-rich diet, we got to attribute some of that effect to the lack of consumption of plant foods, which goes back to your question. So what do plant foods have that animal foods don't? Plant foods have a lot of antioxidants, beautiful compounds. Some of them are called vitamins, like vitamin C and vitamin E and so forth. These antioxidants, countless in number. They have a certain chemical property to them. What they do, they kind of sop up the any kind of free radical production in our bodies that otherwise come from animal foods, for one thing. So antioxidants are really great. Plants also have all the complex carbohydrates that we need, and that's critical. Complex carbohydrates, you know, especially in the microbiome and the intestine, if you will, and that throughout the intestinal tract. Fiber, dietary fiber, part of that complex carbohydrate. That kind of material is critical. It's really critical for a number of different reasons, and not the least of which it tends to support the correct population of microorganisms in our gastrointestinal tract, for example. And so eating animals, we miss out on the complex carbohydrates. We miss out, and by the way, complex carbohydrates, plants tend to be lower in fat. So the fact that they are lower in fat means that we got to get the calories from someplace else. So all those calories come from complex carbohydrates. That's where we should get our calories from carbohydrate, not really from the crude fiber. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the starchy materials. That's where we should get, not from the fat. So lots of things. Plants have antioxidants. They have minerals too. There's some minerals in there. that are beneficial. So it's hard to put a finger on any one thing. It's not a very good idea anyhow. But
and when you, just to make it clear, because there's always this fight between carbs, but very often we are focusing on the bad carbs, and differentiating that would be very important, that complex carbohydrates, the whole food plant-based diet is different, because we are not eating what became norm in the Western world, the processed foods, pizzas, burgers. Those are very different carbohydrates, right?
yeah, absolutely. And that's a very important question. Many people may know that the word low carb came from a book by a certain Dr. Robert Atkins in the United States back in the 1970s. And he was at the time, there was a reaction, he and some others, reaction against some of the information that was coming out at that time about consuming a low-fat diet, in order to reduce cancer. And I was on one of those committees, so I know that firsthand. So Atkins wanted to fight back, and he said, no, we were saying decrease total fat, meaning mostly animal food. Did it say protein, total fat? He said, no, it's, when you do that, you're increasing carbohydrate. He said, that's the problem. Heart disease, cancer, it comes from this high carbohydrate you're talking about in the plants. So he didn't understand. I mean, the man never published a paper in his life, to be honest about it. He had an MD, and some people doubted that, but he had a book, and it became very popular. So he started blaming these Western diseases on overconsumption of high carbohydrate diets. And to support his contention, his point of view on that, it's always possible to tell a big lie with a little truth. And so what he did, he focused on the refined carbohydrates, the sugar, if you will, the glucose, sucrose, that's been isolated from the plant. We use it, liberally in making all the pastries and so forth that we do. That's obvious, and soft drinks. So that kind of carbohydrate, that can be problematic. It's not the whole plant. It can be problematic. So he was seizing on the idea that these simple carbohydrates are not the healthiest thing in the world. And he's taken that to use it to whitewash and blanket, the dismissal, let's say, of all the carbohydrate plants. I mean, that was the trickery about this.
He certainly made a lot of money out of it.
They made a lot of money out of it, and still today. And so what we do see, and unfortunately got a little support again, superficially, people who went on these low carb diets, if they were way overweight, they lost some weight. People like that. So it was impressive. And that was happening because they were consuming a low carb, high protein, high fat diet. And that was breaking down the fatty tissue in the body to some extent. Total calorie intake was down. So in the short run, yeah, people lost some weight. And that impressed people. Oh, that's for me. And that became called the keto diet, because the fatty acids the fats were being broken down into what we call ketone bodies, for one thing. And so then it decided, these ketone bodies, let's go. Let's take them out. Let's make them into some products and reduce fat intake or obesity. And now they're using it for treating cancer patients, for God's sakes. I mean, it's just kind of ridiculous. So the keto diet now, it's called the keto diet, not the Atkins diet, it's been around. It still is. It looms large because it's basically a reaction against. It's sort of it's something that people can turn to who don't want to use the whole food plant-based diet. I'll use the keto diet. Yeah, I can lose some weight there.
Quick response, quick results culture, unfortunately, fits into this really well, doesn't it? But unfortunately, it's harming our patients, and they usually go back to how they ate before, and very, very short response, short-lived, isn't it?
That's right. These short-term presumed claims, they don't last. Because people are consuming, let's say, one of the Atkins diet, they have a much higher risk of heart disease and cancer and diabetes long term than the other side. So Atkins himself died of heart disease at 73.
Yeah.
And I think this is the problem of the very reductionist approach to research, to medicine that we take these days. For example, people talk about micronutrients. Where do I get the most whatever from? But food actually